The Mondragon Cooperative is made up of 255 companies working in different fields. Most families in this small town of 20,000 people make their living from the cooperative. Unemployment is just over 9% in the region. The Spanish national average is double that. Corporate headquarters look down over the town. General Secretary Arantxa Lascurain coordinates the finances. The parts of the cooperative which are faring well support those which are struggling.
We can't deny that the crisis is affecting our business, but there are differences between us and other companies that will help us emerge from the crisis successfully. On the whole, we're still growing. We've been able to maintain worker levels by making the necessary adjustments. Over the past 50 years, the Mondragon Cooperative has learned how to master different crises.
The Mondragon Cooperative owns companies with a global reputation. A few kilometers downriver, the Danubat Group makes machine tools for customers like Siemens and General Electric. Business is good at the moment, despite the poor economic situation in Spain.
How do you prepare for something like this? You try to become more international, so you don't rely on individual markets. You look for strategic areas that are less affected by the crisis and develop technologies that are hard to copy. And you need some luck.
95% of the machines Danubat makes are for export, mainly to China and Germany, and demand is growing. That means the company needs more workers at the moment. Engineer Aitor Corta worked in a different Mondragon company until recently. But there wasn't enough for him to do there, so he moved to Danubat.
I'm part of something bigger. If circumstances mean that there isn't enough work for me in my company, then instead of ending up on the street, I still have the chance to find another job in another firm belonging to the cooperative.
Welcome to the Michael Brooks Show. Left is best. Ladies and gentlemen, we are live broadcasting from downtown Brooklyn, USA with super producer Matt Leck.
Hello.
Chief economist David Griscom.
How's it going?
Super producer David Slavic roaming the digitosphere and the ever-expanding TMBS universe. On this week's program, Brian Mier. He is the editor of the Brazil Wire, the most important English language independent left source of news on Brazil. A massive fascist scandal on the road to the potentially catastrophically electing a fascist president in Brazil. A corporate purchasing of WhatsApp information to spread fake news, PSYOPs, intelligence services, fascism, and Brazil, and the 200th day of the political imprisonment of former President Lula da Silva. Plus, we have a shout out to historical progress in Uruguay. Donald Trump is really, really disturbed by what happened with Jamal Khashoggi, or what happened after what happened to Jamal Khashoggi. We'll touch on that, as well as David Griscom with the GEM, Griscom Economic System. He's talking about where the profit goes. Leck is going to regulate something about our mindshare economy. And we've got a post game with Andrew Gillum owning it as he surges in the polls. Caravan lies, how they're spread by the Trump regime, and a whole lot more as we build out this TMBS vision. It's less than 2 weeks till Election Day. get out there and vote for every single Democrat. Doesn't end that way, but it's going to need to start that way. But first, let's talk about how you can own your economy and why you need to own your economy. This past weekend, I was in Boise, Idaho, and among a number of things, I want to say, first of all, of course, shout out to Boise DSA and my new friend Andrew out there, who are doing incredible organizing work, and, of course, Expand Idaho, Luke Mayville, my friend's incredible initiative to bring Medicaid expansion to the state of Idaho, doing incredible real politics and grassroots work out there. Luke, of course, the person who foisted David Griscom on the TMBS program. And in addition to that, I had the opportunity to meet with and speak to and lecture another enemy of David Griscom, and that, of course, is Professor Richard Wolff, who will be appearing on this show sometime fairly soon. And Professor Wolff left me with two strong impressions, or I should say three. One, I'm concerned for David's safety. But the other two things are serious. One, for almost all of human history, at least Western industrial human history, we took the idea for hundreds of years of slavery as a given. The utter horrific human barbarism that is slavery. We took the ownership and oppression and theft of feudalism as a given. And today we take as a given that a capital class will steal your wages, steal your labor in the form of profit, and can turn it into concentrated wealth, increase inequality, and dictate power inside the workplace, which is where most of us spend our lives in a completely undemocratic fashion. We've taken that for granted as well. But these things are not necessary. They aren't encoded in our biology. They're not justified by a scientific misreading of lobsters, as an example. They're political economies that are generated through politics, through power, through relationships, and through how we decide to shape our lives. And we can, and we possibly might, do significantly better. We also might do significantly worse. The world could turn into a giant merging of Amazon and China. And with, of course, all respect to Chinese culture, history, and civilization, the Chinese model of the current PRC is not going to offer a better alternative to the abuse and imperialism of the United States and the Western system. Unfortunately, it just generates a different version of sort of top-down capitalism. That's essentially what we're talking about, and in some cases, corporate neo-feudalism. On the completely opposite end of the spectrum, there are many places in the world today that run cooperative economies. They run businesses and enterprises and even large regional networks like Madragon that you saw in the beginning that are owned and run by workers. Now, this is one element of any type of transition to a democratic and post-capitalist future. Jeremy Corbyn gets this, and he's most likely going to be the next prime minister of the United Kingdom. Check out Jeremy Corbyn talking about this cooperative economy.
Too many areas of our country are being held back by low investment, low quality jobs, low wages, and slow growth. Inequalities of class, race, and gender are very stark all across Britain. We promised to put economic power into the hands of the many, to transform the economy from top to bottom, doubling the size of our cooperative sector, putting key sectors, water, energy, rail, and Royal Mail into new and democratic forms of public ownership.
Capitalism has not brought us democracy. It has shrunk our democracy and limited our capacity to govern ourselves democratically in all areas of life. That is fundamental to the socialist enterprise, a democratization, a belief that human beings who have the capacity to reason, think, and create together can actually govern their lives and own their own economies. And let's talk a little bit more specifically about what this means. I'm going to read off from three examples. The Madragon Corporation, which goes back to the 1950s. It was founded by a socially oriented Catholic priest in a high unemployment region in the Basque region in Spain. Mondragon compromises 266 bodies, 98 of which are cooperatives, with 80,818 employees. And in 2017 was close to 100. Considered the stark difference between Mondragon and other Spanish corporations during the recession. Workers were able to protect a significant amount of jobs. In Mondragon, I think the unemployment rate got close to, if I'm reading this correctly, 200.28 million unemployed, and in the rest of Spain, it was 11.28 million. They were able to protect themselves because they had cooperative decision-making, and they were able to actually insulate themselves from layoffs by making different decisions about the strategic nature of their businesses. Workers make decisions collectively, including wage increases and cuts. Management answers to all the workers. In fact, they're voted on by workers, and they manage democratic structures inside the Mondragon collective. It is a resilient even in downtimes, and now I'm going to quote from The Guardian in 2018. There is little flashy about the offices of the Basque Country's biggest industrial company, but then there is nothing normal about what is now the world's biggest working cooperative with global sales of close to 13 billion. When times are bad, we cut wage costs by deciding amongst ourselves. And as owners, they swear off of dividends. In other words, deciding amongst themselves who is and isn't laid off.
Wouldn't you just rather have your boss just decide?
Yeah, I would much prefer. It would be much more democratic to just have my boss control my livelihood at all times. Cleveland, Ohio has the Evergreen Cooperative and is based on the Mondragon network. It aims to create worker-owned businesses that pay living wages. Evergreen Energy Solutions, which aims to build sustainable energy like solar in Cleveland. Green City Growers grows fresh produce for the city of Cleveland and delivers produce to customers within 48 hours of harvest. Evergreen Cooperative Laundry provides laundry services to hotels, hospitals, and hospitality businesses in Cleveland and uses high-quality, sustainable practices and ingredients. The cooperative movement is leveraged by encouraging major industries, healthcare and higher education, to invest their money into the local community, improving the lives of the community, and creating economic development and improving the city. This employs dozens of workers at these companies that own their own lives and economies, providing businesses that have a real and significant impact in Cleveland and in the surrounding municipalities. This is also being worked on in Jackson, in Mississippi. Cooperative Jackson is aiming to build an alternative, democratically controlled economy in Jackson. They want to create community land trusts, buy homes and land, and add them into the community land trust in a democratically controlled fashion. This will help them provide low-income housing and create an eco-village affordable housing with stable rents to revive a working-class community in Jackson, Mississippi. And alongside this will be construction firms, food co-ops, waste management, farming, child care, as well as arts and culture cooperatives. This works. Mondragon has an incredible accomplishment, but there's nothing special about people in Mondragon. All people have these capacities inside themselves, and this is what is so important too. You don't need to idealize people to recognize that people have talent, they have capacity, and they have reason and ability. That actually is a fulfillment of the Marxist project. I made this point before, that Marx was a fulfillment of the Enlightenment in contrast to these silly postmodern talking points. Marx thought that people deserved freedom, equality, and liberty because people could think for themselves and do for themselves and do for each other and create bonds of cooperation, opportunity, and fulfillment. This is a practical expression of that. And it's not a utopia, it's not perfection, it's not the end, but it is something that is working across the globe and will be accelerated in the United Kingdom under a Labour government under Jeremy Corbyn. And it is something that is happening in the grassroots across this country. So let's look to own our own economies and move forward into a truly democratic future when one day we'll look at the sort of corporate titans that run our world as the same as the feudal lords that are best remembered by Monty Python making fun of them. Guys, any thoughts to add to this?
Yeah, you look at the cooperative movement in Jackson, Mississippi, and Cleveland. It's been very encouraging to see because not only are people able to sort of take control over their lives and their local economies, but they're also able to make these very important ethical and environmental decisions. So you look at, like, for example, laundry in Cleveland. Laundry is an incredibly wasteful industry. It has a very large carbon footprint, and being able to make those decisions outside of the profit motive that encourage, greener solutions, that the kind of things that we need, is definitely, like, the thing about cooperatives and workplace democracy is it's not just that it's better for workers, it's better for the environment, it's better for the globe, because we can make these important decisions that just have not come out of a competition private market system.
And also, these don't mean that you're sitting my buddy Thaddeus Russell, his whole anxiety attack he had was that if we had worker cooperatives, you'd need to be in meetings all day. They still decide and outsource leadership and management functions. It's just that those people are democratically accountable to the people that they represent. And there's huge amounts of private inefficiencies, like getting terrorized by Walmart or other chains with anti-union propaganda to block people from organizing for themselves so they can make a living. So, and also, I think people actually enjoy exercising some power over their lives in the most important part of their lives, or at least where most people spend most of their time, which is, in fact, at the workplace.
Well, it's like if you've ever worked at any kind of business, especially like a small business, something that's like in the restaurant industry, for example. I don't know, many people I'm sure have had this experience where the business might be struggling a little bit and the boss sort of needs people to come in and work extra hours to keep, the system, afloat.
Right.
And as a worker who has no stake in the betterment of, my boss,
right.
I don't really feel any reason to like help out a little bit and to do the, and they always are sort of guilted on a kind of emotional level. And that's not the way that these kind of things work. Right. Meanwhile, in a workplace democracy situation, if there does need to be, extra help lifting the load, for example, like we were talking about in Spain during, economic decline, making tough decisions, you make those as a community and as a group in a way that one is, fairly distributed against all people, unlike the way that it's done now, where poor workers, people who are making minimum wage, are guilted by some person who's making a nice salary off of their business into coming in extra,
or threatened,
late, of course,
terrorized.
I'm talking about the nicer version where they're just like, we're family here, and that's bullshit, right? Meanwhile, yeah, but of course there are plenty of moments where people are exploited and threatened and told that, if you don't come in, the business is going to shut down, then you're going to lose your job.
Yep.
And that's not a good way to run a business either.
Yeah, well, I'd say it shows the success of right-wing's propaganda that the main way people think of themselves as being governed is by the federal government and not their, boss and purchasing power. Yeah,
and in fact, that is where, if we were to limit it to voting, you vote every couple of years if you vote. And there are other great, protesting occupations and so on. But day in and day out, if you work at a private enterprise in some fashion like that, that is where you spend most of your time, and you're not in a democratic atmosphere. And there's no need on any level for that. And there's many examples of not only the opposite working from a business and worker outcomes perspective, but of course, as David said, these giant expanding circles of benefits. A bunch of people set up a brewery together. Why would they shut it down? Why would you export jobs overseas? Why would you, pollute your local tributaries, as an example? Or as several examples. These have all sorts of ancillary benefits, and they also expand the range of what people think is possible in all areas of their lives.
And that's the biggest point too. There's the people who are in the cooperative itself, but then the idea is more cooperatives are brought up, that this becomes more of a community thing, a city thing, something that's figured out as a community. What kind of businesses do we want? What kind of services is this community lacking? And you can find those needs be met in much better ways. So like you look at which companies right now, for example, are growing the most and in this era of low wage and wage stagnation. Dollar General,
right?
Like these kind of like low end, cheap end stores are just popping up everywhere in low income communities to provide really cheap, crappy goods. But they're the only thing that people can afford in that.
And
community.
then extreme luxury on the other end.
And then
we're at the barbell economy.
No, exactly. But it's like imagine if the community says, well, these are we need affordable goods in our community, but we don't need cheap goods. We don't need goods that are exploitive. We don't need goods that. Aren't going to give us healthy options, healthy foods. It's something that as a community that you are able to choose, rather than what's happened now is they just these things are just sort of dropped into communities, and they're like the only source of positive revenue.
We don't want to gentrify. We want to keep rents affordable. We want housing and homes and healthcare and childcare for all. We want businesses that add, not subtract, not little sort of micro colonial systems that displace people, despoil their local ecosystems, and then generate economies that cater to the ultra wealthy and gut everybody else. Well,
I was just going to say one small thing on the markets and housing specifically is like when people hear the phrase "let the market decide," what they really mean is let the richest people decide.
Right.
And like the more inequality, like markets would be great if everyone had the equal amount of purchasing power, because that's sort of like that's a very democratized system. That's what Hayek fetishized, right? But obviously that's not the case. It gets more and more centralized, and
that's also why in the least problematic part of capitalism is the marketplace, right? Like people need to get that. Like when you hear marketplace, like you could even get really idealized. Like say you go to your local farmer's market, and it's great. You're buying healthy food that's good for the environment directly from the farmers. I mean, that's pretty nice. It's not perfect. Nothing's perfect, but it's pretty nice. But when you hear capitalism, you should be thinking of what completely separates your labor from your purchasing power and your ability to actually own and exercise power over resources, not the marketplace. Because, and of course, what they're really saying when they say the marketplace is they're actually, and what Hayek and all those totally delusional fools were actually saying was like when they say, oh, no, private sector is not coercive because you freely enter into an exchange. Like, hi, I'm a, low-income 60-year-old worker who needs to work 3 jobs to feed myself and my family, and I'm going to walk up to Walmart, and by golly, we're going to sit across from the table from each other and have a democratic negotiation, and then we're going to solidify it in contract law. And that's literally, I mean, that complete escape from reality is what all that ideology is predicated on, whether it's housing or jobs or anything else.
And that, if I remember correctly, when I was going over Corey Robin's Reactionary Mind, that goes back to Burke, who said, like, if you are voluntarily giving up something of yours because someone's pointed a gun at you, you're nonetheless doing it voluntarily.
Right,
because you'd rather do that than get shot.
Well, that's the Milton Friedman example.
Oh, maybe it was Milton Friedman.
Well, it's another equally as insane thing. If somebody said some people can't afford BMWs because they would starve, and he said no, like they choose not to starve and buy the BMW, never not a choice. And you can start to realize that it would be like a weird little subcategory of people to laugh at if they weren't dictating macroeconomic policy across the globe.
Yeah, these are the people that laugh at transgender people with the phrase I want to be a helicopter, right? Like that sort of nonsensical.
Yeah, exactly.
I want to have health insurance.
Yeah, ha ha ha. Right. We should. Yes. Exactly. It is the Scientology of politics, although Scientology probably does more for people. All right, let's get to the shout out. And I think it's actually very appropriate, this shout out, because of the transphobia of our buddy here in this song.
Shout out, shout out, shout out. Weird. I think that's creepy. It's incredible. Shout out, shout out, shout out, shout out. This is crazy. Shout out, shout out, shout out, shout out. This is out of control. Shout out, shout out. That's creepy. Shout out, shout out.
That's weird. reporting in the New York Times that the Trump administration is considering a directive that would quite literally write transgender people out of existence. Really, and things are so fast because time is dilated, as former news InfoWars contributor Mike Cernovich said. Time is dilated and things are moving very fast. But people probably might not have awareness of this if this isn't your direct experience, but these modest interventions and hugely necessary ones for the civil rights of transgender people by the Obama administration are these obviously incredibly new spaces of policy for what is a group that is usually discriminated against and much more likely to be subjected to physical attacks. The Trump administration is apparently considering throwing that all out the window, another act of eliminationism from the Republican Party and the Trump administration. And that just needs to be noted in the context of this shout-out. That really is just sort of necessary due practice here. But in much more, well, in not more, in completely the opposite news, Uruguay, a small Latin American country, a country that, like many other countries in Latin America, had a dirty war backed by the CIA where liberals and leftists were hunted and murdered across the region. A left has persisted in Uruguay. And what that left has done in the form of its current government, among many other positive things, has passed a law granting rights to trans people. If you could scroll down a little bit, we have this up on screen, the AP story. I'll read from it a bit. Uruguay's Congress has approved a law guaranteeing the rights to the South American country's transgender community. Lawmakers in the House voted in favor of a measure late Thursday. It has already been approved by the Senate. The law grants transgender people a right to get an operation that matches their sexual identity. It will be paid for by the Uruguayan state, along with hormone treatments. The law also ensures the minimum number of transgender people are given public jobs in the next 15 years. It mandates that 1% of jobs be reserved and establishes a pension commenced to compensate transgender people who were persecuted during Uruguay's 1973 to 1985 military dictatorship. This is a beautiful piece of legislation. I love the threading of forward-looking visionary policy with a recognition of history. We can all learn from that as we coordinate policy globally, and we continue, even in the face of this onslaught of the time we're in, for a just, humane, and fully abundant world for all. Shout out Uruguay. And now we're going to do a little pitch, and then we're going to go to Brian Mier. And for this pitch, we have yet another fire from the always fire, relentlessly fire, DJ Danarchy. DJ Danarchy's a very talented dude. Good
Ask
news.
the moms.
He turned my props to DJ Danarchy into a Kavanaugh joke.
Even the moms know about Danarchy.
Even the moms know about Danarchy. Is he into that? I'm sorry. We are well on our way, actually. I'm getting a little scared now to that next goal of 2,000 patrons, and then we will have the horrifying food bucket challenge. Get your bets in. Who's going to take it? When you become a patron of the Michael Brooks Show, you have a fully integrated and broad-based political education with a real strong focus on the global dimension of not only struggles and parallels, but also incredible opportunities and successes and real reasons for optimism in the midst of all of the challenges we face. It's also a funny show. It's also a show that you get to have a lot of participation in the post-game and all of the other shenanigans that we get up to, plus, of course, the Woke Bros Enterprise, which we're going to have some new announcements for. And early in the new year, I'll have specifics soon, but things like live shows and swag, they're turning from, they're about to become concrete material realities. So become a patron today. Patreon.com/TMBS, Patreon.com/TMBS. Also, please, if you haven't yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel. As soon as that's monetized, we're moving the live show over there. We have a lot of clips to start people in on the show, from the incredible political synthesis to Black Panthers, which offers incredible opportunities and lessons for today, to dunking on Ana Navarro, to your indispensable clearinghouse for the intellectual dork web, to, of course, the in-depth coverage on Brazil, South Africa, the Middle East, and the best assessments, right in line, of course, with the majority report of left politics today in the United States. Join patreon.com/TMBS. Subscribe on iTunes. Subscribe on YouTube. We'll be right back with Brian Mier, The Michael Brooks Show. Welcome back to The Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now is Brian Mier. He is the co-editor of Brazil Wire. Brian joins us now from Brazil. Thanks for being here, Brian.
Thanks a lot. How's it going?
It's going well. It's always good to be speaking with you. We've been covering Brazil extensively on this show. Also have had you on the Majority Report, obviously. We're coming out of the shock of the incredible performance by the fascist candidate Jair Bolsonaro in the first round of voting. It looks like there might be, if I'm reading correctly, maybe, on one hand, a couple of grounds for optimism in terms of polls and in terms of maybe in some ways potentially how the electorate is reading the election. And then on the other hand, maybe some really ominous signs that even if the polls are reversed, that we really are entering into a more kind of fully realized coup situation in Brazil. You'll correct me on that one way or another. But before we get to the specifics of things like what happened with WhatsApp and where we're at in the race, what do things look like now? Like, are the polls tightening up? Does it look a little bit different? And are the signals still being sent from Bolsonaro and the military that even if they were, that they're considering another scenario?
Yeah, the polls appear to be tightening a little bit. Dilma Rousseff was losing in the polls before the second round in 2014, and she still won. Mm-hmm. But the real question, the real issue is that Bolsonaro said if he loses, he's not going to respect the result. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And he's got the military backing him up. Yeah. And the Supreme Court now, and most of the media, and Wall Street. Right.
Take us through that. There's been a complete collapse of any sort of liberal pretensions of any type of kind of coalition or foundational concern about protecting democracy. I guess one exception seems to be The Economist, but obviously the business sector, both in the United States and Brazil, and you mentioned the Supreme Court. Maybe could you bring in and explain this WhatsApp story and how it's played out as an example of really how solidified everybody's getting on board with this fascist momentum right now?
Well, as it turns out, WhatsApp is a Facebook product. Mm-hmm. Facebook has a long history of screwing up elections. Yes. Normally benefiting the right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Zuckerberg, he donated 12 employees to the Trump campaign. And so WhatsApp is a Facebook product. It's a messenger system that you can use to send messages and make phone calls on via the internet, mm-hmm. which is how it got so popular in Brazil, because Brazil has some of the world's most expensive airtime. Mm-hmm. So when you can use internet, you save money. Nobody's making regular cell phone calls anymore, basically, because of WhatsApp. Mm-hmm. So Brazil's the largest consumer of WhatsApp in the world. Over half the population uses it, and it allows you to form groups of up to 256 people. Now, Jair Bolsonaro has been in Congress for 28 years, and he's only passed 2 pieces of legislation the entire time, and one of them, mysteriously, was related to WhatsApp last year. Okay, so anyway, several months ago, his son went up to visit Steve Bannon in Washington, D.C., tweeted out the photo. He said, Bannon's going to support us on the campaign. And whether he's supporting openly or not, it doesn't matter, because the tricks that they're using are the same as something that Bannon or Cambridge Analytica would do. Basically, last week a scandal broke that private businessmen, elite like rentier, comprador, business class actors in Brazil were paying millions of dollars to this illegal campaign slush fund. It was several times larger than the amount that Bolsonaro officially declared for his campaign. And the money was used to hire these tech companies to obtain personal information of millions of WhatsApp users in Brazil and set up these thousands and thousands of groups of 256 people each, called things like The Myth, Bolsonaro the Myth, and things like that, and just literally bombard targeted segments of the population with slander, lies, hate speech. And I'll give you a quick example. You know, there was these Not Him protests all over the world a couple of weeks ago that were greatly underreported in The Guardian and the New York Times. They said tens of thousands of people on the street. Just in Sao Paulo, there were 150,000. And the protests took place in 20 countries around the world, right?
Right.
So these Not Him protests were women-led movement against Bolsonaro because of his misogyny.
Yes.
Okay, so the day of the Not Him protests, they sent out thousands and thousands of images, you know, of slut walk photos, of topless lesbians kissing each other, and they targeted evangelical women with this, evangelical Christian women, and said they were photos taken live at the Not Him protests. And as a result, Bolsonaro's popularity increased by 5% in the polls in the couple days after the Not Him protests, and the analytics show that it was mostly evangelical Christian women. So, and this is just like one example of the kinds of dirty tricks they were doing. These
and haven't they've said that like Haddad, like, you know, and his vice presidential candidate, like, aren't that they're not married, that they worship Satan, or they've insulted Jesus. Again, all stuff designed to trigger evangelical voters. Yeah,
but even more sophisticated than that, right?
Yeah,
This is stuff that was clearly tested on people before they launched it. It's very sophisticated. They posted a film that was completely fake film, alleging that Haddad, as mayor of Sao Paulo, distributed erotic baby bottles with penis-shaped nipples on them to preschool students when he was mayor of Sao Paulo. You know, and they said that they sent out a Photoshop photo of Manuela Dávila, the vice presidential candidate, with a T-shirt on that said "Jesus is a transvestite." And, you know, and all kinds of dirty tricks and stories that would have been illegal. You know, Facebook announced they were going to police this kind of thing during the election season on Facebook, but they didn't do it on WhatsApp.
Yeah, this is another reason why, I mean, of course, you know, all these stories matter innately, and then there are these global parallels that we have to track. There was that investigative report, and again, this isn't Cambridge Analytics, and it's not necessarily at all the same, you know, staff or anything like that, although we do know of these meetings with Bannon. But there was that investigative report that British journalists did where they posed as potential Cambridge Analytica clients. And the Cambridge Analytica executive, first of all, gave a sense of they've worked campaigns in everywhere from, I think it was Croatia to Kenya, and they used very specific examples of primarily, in some cases, actually potentially setting up real events in an attempt to, you know, entrap and embarrass and blackmail politicians, but also the same sort of playbook with these fake news things, which, you know, here I think in the United States people have kind of pushed back a little bit because it's been used by, you know, basically some in the Democratic Party to sort of not want to take any kind of broader assessment or stock of the election. But at the same time, it did matter here. And it always plays to people's racial and gender prejudices, you know, here very much so, obviously. But even, you know, in a place like Kenya, it overlapped with, even as an example, in other, you know, previous disputed elections in Kenya before Cambridge Analytics, like actual mass killings related to disputing vote totals. So this is what's happening in Brazil. We don't know it's Cambridge Analytics, but it's the same toolkit. And just as there's a shared ideological overlaps, even if there are differences of this global far right, they actually have a campaign and technology toolkit, if I understand you correctly, that's happening in Brazil as we speak.
Yeah, and I mean, it's obviously something that's too sophisticated for Bolsonaro's previously tiny political party.
Right.
And the limited intelligence of most of the people belonging to that party. Like most of the politicians are military or police officers or evangelical Christian pastors. There's no or third-rate celebrities, you know. But we do know from Edward Snowden that the U.S. and UK have set up intelligence services that have departments dedicated to manipulating information through the internet, like the Joint Threat Research Intelligence Group of Government Communications Headquarters from Great Britain, the GCHQ. You know, I mean, their whole reason for existence is manipulating public opinion on the internet. So there's a lot of reasons to assume that this manipulation that's happening right now, it's almost a kind of massive brainwashing of the Brazilian people has at least partially come from the outside. You know, it would be very naive to think that on a continent where the U.S. engaged in 44 successful coups d'etats from 1898 to 1994, proven, you know, cited by Harvard in the Harvard magazine or whatever. It would be naive to think that the U.S. was not, or that American petroleum companies were not involved in this. You know, so anyway.
So what I want to hope. I mean, I don't know if there's no hope, we won't end with any hope. But I do want to talk more about the counter left strategy in Brazil. But before we get to, and also touch on Lula, this is the 200th day that he's been imprisoned, and obviously the backlash to him fits into all of this in a way that's particularly disturbing, given that, as I always say, Lula was the ultimate win-win leader. He did, managed to accomplish so much without actually really fundamentally harming any of the types of interests that we're talking about that are so damaging and dangerous. But before we go there, can you talk, I guess, specifically about some of the ways that you see the U.S. multinational influence, and maybe tie that with, you've been really persistent on the failures of the New York Times and the Guardian in their coverage of Brazil.
Yeah, well, first of all, when I talk about the U.S. influence, I'm talking about the expanded state in the Gramscian or Marcusian sense, which is it's the U.S. government and the institutions that support the U.S. government. And these can be the corporate sector, some educational institutions, think tanks, political parties, and big sectors of the media. I mean, you can't say that after all those reports on weapons of mass destruction in Iraq that the American media wasn't supporting the U.S. To build enthusiasm for an Iraq invasion.
Right.
So I feel like the Guardian now, which is more headquartered in the U.S. than England and partially owned by HSBC Bank from China, I don't know where it fits in to the U.S. expanded state. But in terms of U.S. involvement in this all, we have the involvement of corporate think tanks such as ASCOA, it's called American Society Council of the Americas. It's a think tank set up by John Rockefeller in the early 60s, which has been involved in almost every coup in Latin America. They offered to pay $500,000 to the Chilean Senate to block Salvador Allende's taking power when he was elected in Chile in 1970,
Right.
They invited Bolsonaro up on 2 occasions and had closed-door meetings that they facilitated between him and American business leaders, And then afterwards, Bolsonaro announced that his economics guru was this guy named Paulo Guedes, who is an ultra neoliberal, who was actually an economic attaché to Pinochet. So we see on one hand, we see conservative foundations, neoliberal in the case of ASCOA, but also the Atlas Institute is involved in the Brazilian far right. It's provided training and some funding for far right groups.
And that's that's Koch brothers funded, right? And that's a Koch brothers libertarian Latin America propaganda network, and they've been instrumental in a lot of right wing politics, modern iteration in Latin America, if I'm correct.
Yeah. Exactly. And there's a group called the MBL, which they've built up, Then we see I worked on this Al Jazeera listening post episode as a local producer a couple weeks ago, and we interviewed a guy running for a state Congress in Bolsonaro's party. And during the interview, the guy told me, well, we want to legalize guns because guns don't kill people. People kill people. It was like the first time I've ever heard anyone say that in Portuguese. Right. So that just makes me think probably the NRA is involved somehow.
Yeah.
Is what the guy using an NRA talking point. And then we have the very obvious elephant in the room, which is systematically ignored in all of the papers, even the left-wing papers in the U.S., which is the role that the U.S. Department of Justice played in arresting Lula, in contributing towards the impeachment through this Lava Jato Operation Car Wash investigation, which is a joint operation between the Department of Justice, the SEC, Brazilian Federal Police, and public prosecutors' offices, which has already taken over $1 billion in fines for the U.S. government. You know, the U.S. government, through the Department of Justice, collected over $1 billion from Brazilian companies through this operation. But the main objective has clearly been to perform character assassination against prominent politicians in the PT party. When the corruption scandals initially broke, they were across the board, all parties involved, but the only people who they've tried to prosecute have been really essentially, with a few exceptions, members of the PT party. And the tactics
and other left-wing leaders across Latin America, right?
Oh, yeah. Well, now the U.S. DOJ is using the Brazilian Odebrecht construction company as a kind of Trojan horse to attack left-wing politicians all over. So they've tied Michelle Bachelet up to some frivolous corruption charge involving Odebrecht in Chile. You know, they took out they took out he wasn't really left-wing, but he was a bit too much of a nationalist in the sense of protecting Peruvian assets for the U.S. to accept. They took out the Peruvian president. There have been 7 former presidents or current presidents and vice presidents that have been removed from office or had charges pressed against them through this Operation Car Wash, which is now international. And they've even arrested a former cabinet minister in Mozambique using Odebrecht, you know, and with U.S. Department of Justice collaboration. Now, this isn't a conspiracy theory or anything, because Kenneth Blanco, the acting assistant attorney general, talked about all of this in a speech that was televised at the Atlantic Council in 2017. He talked about the constant informal communication between the U.S. Department of Justice and the Operation Car Wash team. The problem is that that's a crime in Brazil. Brazilian government officials are not allowed to have informal communications with foreign government officials. It's a sovereignty issue. This communication bypasses all of the checks and balances that were designed to protect the sovereignty of Brazil against imperialism.
And you don't, and again, like, they don't need to even direct which way it will go in terms of prosecutions or how it will be leveraged by Brazil's oligarchic media to know that, of course, if you sort of unleash this thing, that it will be politicized and that it will be used to go after certain actors, you know, certain parts, essentially to try to delegitimize PT party, which is how it's been used in Brazil. Can you indulge me just for 1 second here? And I don't want to get too detailed into this, but, you know, I did comment on this a little while ago about a very popular, supposedly left-wing YouTube commentator. And in some ways, I don't even want to bring you into this because I actually hope he'll have you on his show, frankly, to kind of correct the record. But in 2017, sorry.
I listened to you talking about him on the program.
Yeah.
So I know what you're talking.
You know, and I guess the biggest response I've heard is that I was being, or some people say I was just being rude and intellectually elitist by pointing that out, and other people said the videos from 2017, and no one could have any idea what Lava Jato was then. So could you? I mean, what do you think of that? It seems to me that in 2017 we already had a pretty clear signal of how this was being used against democratic forces in Brazil.
Well, yeah, it was a key factor in the coup.
Right.
Even to the point where the New York, and I hate to bring them up again, New York Times and Guardian, you know, and I'm using them as examples, but you could say Washington Post, CNN, Atlantic Magazine, whatever you want. these journalists were constantly associating Dilma Rousseff with Operation Car Wash in the year before the coup. And she had no involvement. They tried as hard as they could. They couldn't even build any case against her in Operation Car Wash.
Right.
But she was associated with Petrobras, petroleum company corruption. Even John Oliver said something really obnoxious and ironic about it at the time that was untrue.
Yep.
Yep. And so
people have also gotten mad at me for criticizing John Oliver because of his horrific Mexico segment. But I guess for some people, their HBO Go funnies are more important than Latin America policy. But
I guess it's a bit of a pass because he did something good about Bolsonaro. A couple of weeks ago, everyone's sharing on. So maybe I'll give him a pass today.
I did notice on that video, if we're grading on a curve, the other thing he did too is he did pretty much say you got to vote for Haddad because you can't support Bolsonaro, which is of course the main point. And the other thing I noticed is that he did he acknowledged Lula was the most popular and said his arrest was a disputed issue and left it at that. So it probably is actually a real improvement.
Not good enough, though, for someone who calls himself a progressive. If he's saying Lula's arrest was a disputed,
I forget the words, or some say or something or other. But that brings us. I do want us to talk about Lula, and I'll say to everybody who jokes about it, I'm going to keep talking about Lula. To me, it's definitely talking about one of the most important political prisoners on the planet. It's an important conversation in and of itself, but also in ways that reflect all the other dynamics you're talking about. I want, actually, before we get broader, can you just remind everybody what this charge and conviction of Lula has been that not only has put him in jail, but has been a complete silencing? Not only a disbarring from running for president, he can't do media interviews according to the Brazilian Supreme Court, and he still almost certainly would have won this race. And also, this is a country where murderers and former cartel heads and people like that regularly do TV interviews from prison.
Yeah, it's true. And, once again, the U.S. has its fingerprint in all of this.
Yeah.
Okay. Lula was originally charged with a bunch of frivolous charges that he was involved in money laundering and bribery, a bribery and money laundering scandal involving Petrobras, involving OAS Construction Company. And these charges, these original charges, were repeated in the Anglo media even after his sentence was done. And, for example, during his sentence, Judge Sergio Moro said there's absolutely no proof of any connection between Lula and Petrobras, right? But The Guardian, the day Lula was arrested, said that the charges were connected with 49 million reais worth of bribes in Petrobras, okay?
Right.
So that's one thing. All they ever ended up convicting him of, right? It started with this mega organized crime operation with millions of dollars of bribery. And then they started narrowing down the charges to it being that he had received an apartment as a gift. And then it was that, no, he received free reforms, including construction of an elevator in this apartment. All right. But they had no proof. His name wasn't on the deed. No one in his family's name was on the deed. And they had no proof that he'd ever even visited the place. Okay. And furthermore, the event in question, the way it appears in the court case, happened after he left the presidency. So even if he'd been given 10 giant apartments as gifts, it wouldn't matter because he wasn't in a position of power to influence governmental decisions anymore. He wasn't an elected official.
Right.
But nevertheless, they had no proof that he was ever even in the apartment. And so he was convicted based on Judge Sergio Moro, who'd been working in tandem with the U.S. Department of Justice since at least 2009, that we see in leaked State Department cables. Judge Sergio Moro, who was the prosecutor and the judge. He judged on his own prosecution in this bizarre facet of Brazilian law, which allows judges to rule on their own investigations that initiated during the Inquisition, which still exists in Brazilian law. So he was able to rule on his own investigation. He said, well, we don't have any material evidence, but I have a strong conviction that he did it. Okay? So the actual conviction is for committing undetermined acts of corruption. In other words, they were unable to define what Lula had done in the actual sentence. And first he sentenced him to 9 years because he's a sadist. And I think that this sadism comes from the United States, the way they try to ruin people's lives and, throw white-collar criminals in jail with 90-year sentences until they plea bargain their way out according to a script. He gave Lula 9 years because 9 was his nickname for Lula because Lula has 9 fingers, right? So
it's just so disgusting. I mean, and that's, so you have this despicable, disgusting person. And another reason that I was so annoyed by that absolutely stupid video that I commented on was that, there was a propaganda piece that was played in it where it was completely frivolously praising of Sergio Moro, who, in addition to his own sadism and despicable record, he's also regularly leaked things from his investigations in an illegal manner in an attempt to influence the election. Has also his wife is involved in the oil industry, and I believe has now publicly supported Bolsonaro. And that's another, by the way, a good media example, just to sort of reiterate Brian's point, because that's the conviction. It's literally a sadist with a vendetta saying indeterminate acts, and it's reported in the United States as Lula's in jail on corruption, or if they're being a little bit more loyally, corruption-related charges, which is, of course, like technically true but very misleading. I want to talk a little bit more about, Lula himself, and maybe in a way that could kind of fit in some resistance narratives of resistance in terms of freeing Lula, and also where this is sort of fitting into the state of Brazilian politics today. And this involves a piece that you sent me, which is in the New Socialist. This is a very good piece. I'll tweet it out for everybody. Bolsonaro and the institutionalization of necropolitics. And this sort of fuses together what we got from Lula, where maybe the future of the left and resistance in Brazil might be, and also what's really giving rise to Bolsonaro, or part of what's giving rise to Bolsonaro. And I'm quoting now from the piece. What is happening today is the response of conservative and narrow-minded sectors of society to the social progress made during PT governments, most importantly under Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. Under Lula, the PT solidified public policies for the poor and marginalized majority, removed billions from below the poverty line, and leveraged their social insertion into middle class. All of this without taking anything from the rich. The banks never made as much money as they did during the PT period. Even at the time, the advances made in the Lula era triggered a backlash of hate, and it was also during this period that the largest black population outside of Africa witnessed its genocide level surpass acceptable numbers to a democracy. Every 23 minutes, a young black man is killed in homicides, and homicides against black women rose by 54% in Brazil between 2003 and 2013. All of and now I'm back to me, while Bolsonaro is literally campaigning on giving police even more opportunity and encouraging citizens to get guns, wealthy people, to murder people on the periphery. So I guess my thing is, the accomplishments of Lula in a way that didn't hurt, anybody on the top. If anything, if the only critique of Lula would come from the left, and I have little patience for those critiques, but that's the only place where you get a legitimate one. And now we have this rise of the backlash and the partnership with global capital. Maybe they preferred somebody who was less embarrassing or vulgar than Bolsonaro, but now he's the only game in town, and money will break fascist. And, in the final weeks of this campaign, what does this sort of left, I mean, it also seems in other ways that the left is coming together in some respects, and there's some sort of renewed radicalism and sense of the stakes of the battle.
Yeah, well, first of all, like that, what she said, what the author said is emblematic. He didn't do really anything to piss off the Brazilian business community.
Right.
But his government did a lot of things that angered the international business community and the U.S. government.
Right.
You know, they didn't give Chevron and Exxon access to the offshore oil reserves that they wanted, as Brazil discovered the largest offshore oil reserves in the world, for example, because they favored Brazilian industry. So there's this issue, this geopolitical issue that, that everyone did well during his government, but there was enough things that his government did in terms of working for sovereignty in relation to the U.S. and northern capitalist countries that international capital was angry with him. You know, as far as the left coming together, also, like, I think the best criticisms about the PT are from the PT. I've never heard any foreign left commentator attacking PT from the left who hasn't just been repeating things that the PT says about themselves. They know what happened, what the challenges were. And I think a lot of that criticism often doesn't take into consideration the fact that they never had more than 22% control of Congress. Right. So you'd have to compare his government and what they accomplished to what Obama accomplished in terms of, the Republicans. As far as the future of the left, well, one thing that happened was that after the coup, the Brazilian traditional organized left, social movements and labor unions were re-energized. A lot of young people joined them. They were getting kind of complacent with 13 years of the PT governments giving into some of their demands, not all of their demands, but I feel like they were getting a little bit complacent. And since the coup, they've rallied into two broad-based fronts, one called the Povo Sem Medo, the people without fear, and the other, the Frente Brasil Popular, the Brazilian Popular Front. And these fronts are made up of like student organizations, unions, feminist organizations, and social movements like the MST and the MTST. And they've managed to have, since 2016, well, even just since Lula's arrest, I've counted over 700 different kinds of protests that happened in solidarity with Lula. The problem seems to be that the protest and, the strike and the protest are kind of like weakening as instruments of change in this phase of modern capitalism because the media just ignores them.
Right.
Unless it's convenient for them. So, there's been around 1,000 people camped out in front of where Lula's been held in solitary confinement in Curitiba for 200 days now. And they're yelling good morning, good afternoon, and good night to him every day. And he hears them,
Yep.
And so there's a lot of resistance, but it's hard to say how it's playing out right now. I mean, if the courts didn't allow massive amounts of election fraud, if they didn't break the law, Lula would be running for office. They broke the law to prevent him from running for office. If they didn't allow all of this election fraud committed by the Bolsonaro campaign, Haddad would be winning the election. So it's hard to say what good all of this rallying is doing at the moment if there's no more rule of law in Brazil and if the elections are going to be if the government's going to be handed over to the Bolsonaro and the military, regardless of whether he wins or not.
So, this is not at all hopeful, but maybe it's just now is just the realistic assessment of where exactly things are and realizing what exactly, clearly the Brazilian elite has wanted to have this, and the U.S. multinationals that are backing this process have wanted a patina of legitimacy. But it's clear what it is, and the overtness of it is, revealed more and more every day. And we have all these little flashpoints too, like one judge ordering Lula to be released several months ago, and Sergio Moro breaking the law to refuse it, and then the Supreme Court swooping in to back him up. the not allowing him to grant an interview, the fact that obviously this mass voter fraud, I believe Ciro Gomes, who was the third candidate, said that the election should have been annulled. And, the Supreme Court, which seems to be so sort of hyper-technical and authoritarian when it involves Lula, we can be more relaxed about mass, corporate slush funds and voter fraud. So I don't know. And then maybe from a North American perspective, I mean, obviously Bernie Sanders has centered this, and maybe, it's part of our job as we talk to our politicians and also think of our own national elections in terms of the kind of influence we can have, and also breaking this whole broad global authoritarian right-wing movement that Brazil's manifesting, but is obviously here under Trump in a different way, but here and in Hungary and many other places.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know. There's been some positive news in the regional and state elections. So for example, the Northeast elected in all states but one left-wing governors, and São Paulo has its first trans state congresswoman. And there's a few things that are positive. The one positive thing is that these traditional conservative parties that have their roots in the military dictatorship, that spent the last 12 years slandering the PT and trying to destroy the PT and creating this whole anti-PT vibe, they all were decimated in the elections. So they've gone down from being the second, third, and fourth biggest party in the country down. Between the three parties, they lost like 60 congressmen. So.
And PT is still the largest member, has the largest share in not a majority, obviously, but they still have the most people in parliament.
Yeah, PT, despite all of this years of slander and daily attacks in the media, they only lost 4 congressmen. They're still the biggest party in Congress. The problem is the second biggest party in Congress now is Bolsonaro's party.
Right.
And it's just a bunch of wackos,
right.
who rode on his coattails into office, just like lunatics. One of them is a hardline police officer and evangelical preacher.
Jesus Christ.
With no university.
Right.
Or anything.
So, I mean, and just the last point I'll make before I jump to you for your final thought is that at least in a Brazilian context, but I think that in a radically different way here, if somehow Bernie Sanders gets a nomination in 2020, there's going to be actually some parallel questions with how, say, where does a Mike Bloomberg's money go if it's Donald Trump versus Bernie Sanders, right? Is it, I don't like all the racism and all of the nonsense and insanity, but what is my fundamental allegiance to? Well, maybe probably not paying any taxes, right? So in Brazil, though, it has just been the choice between an economic, tough economic conditions and tough social conditions, and the fact that, of course, Lula would have been actually the closest you could get to kind of a national consensus figure who probably would have governed in a relatively similar fashion, probably a bit more to the left, but in a way that brought people to the table across the board, and foreign capital and the military and many elites broke with complete militarized fascism and bigotry over somebody who would have, really just sort of attempted to create a new sort of national unity. And that says a lot.
Well, this is just the history of Latin America that Eduardo Galeano talks about. The U.S. government has, and its business community, expanded state, has shown time and time again that it prefers fascists to moderate social democracy. Over and over again in Nicaragua, in Chile, Paraguay, Uruguay, Argentina. And so what this shows, when we see the Wall Street Journal endorsing Bolsonaro, when we see the editor from As Coas, America's quarterly magazine, writing an article in the biggest paper in Brazil called Why Wall Street Supports Bolsonaro, what we're seeing is that nothing's changed.
Yep.
So this is just more of the same. It was a lucky time when George Bush decided to prioritize the Middle East and stopped paying attention to Latin America, and left governments were able to pop up and thrive for a decade. And now we're back to like what it was like in the 1970s and 80s, it seems like.
Well, a lot more for us to do and think about and figure out in a new context. And we will continue to do it. And a really important piece of doing it is Brazil Wire. Everybody should be reading this site regularly if you want to understand what's happening in Brazil. And actually, yeah, in some ways, by extension, the whole dynamic between the United States and Latin America and democracy and humanity in Latin America. So, Brian Mier, I really appreciate your work. I really appreciate Brazil Wire, and I hope to do this again soon. And also, I want to also just hold a little bit of the idea that, hope in the face of adversity. The vote actually hasn't happened yet. So let's see.
Well,
yeah.
I'm hoping that Haddad wins. What can I just say one last thing?
Yep.
Zuckerberg stepped in and turned off all of Bolsonaro's WhatsApp machine last week. So now he's shut down all WhatsApp groups over 20 people. So the surge of hate and slander that was supposed to happen this week in the social media is not happening. So that could help propel Haddad to victory.
That's great. And obviously, if Haddad wins, and clearly the military and the Supreme Court, and obviously Bolsonaro is who he is, have shown time and time again that they will go against democracy. But you keep adding these burden layers, right? Like if Lula, led in the polls and they had to show themselves when the judge ordered himself free. If Haddad wins this race and they break against that, that will be an international media event, and that will be very hard for them. So, yes.
What little international legitimacy they have left will be completely destroyed.
Done.
That's for sure.
Yes, entirely. And I think at least here in the United States, too, I think the same people who would lazily go, corruption and blah, 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 would definitely be very upset by that. So Haddad winning that race is obviously still, it's possible and couldn't be more important. And it seems like he's getting a lot tougher in his rhetoric, too.
He is. Yeah, he is. Let's keep our fingers crossed.
Solidarity. Thanks, Brian.
Thanks. It's appreciated. Take it easy.
Take care. All right, folks, really read Brazil Wire. It's a great source. What they do, it would be great if, frankly, every country had. You had, a really smart, for us, selfishly speaking, but the partnership of locals and expats producing just really high-quality analysis.
We need to start growing an alternative infrastructure of media globally. And that's why I actually, I've made this ask before, but if you know of any different language leftist podcasts that are sort of majority report of, I would be interested in French because I'm trying to keep my French skills a bit sharp, but Spanish, interested, Portuguese, anything, go for it. Let us know. Tweet us or IM us.
This is how we're going to build that alternative infrastructure. I had a conversation actually with a great journalist. It was on Majority Report, and I realized Francesco Pacifico, and we talked about the fascist tactics on Twitter in Italy, specifically of Sabatini. And one of the things that we actually concluded, one of the problems in Italy actually was that left media and left cultural responses was so far behind. And one thing that maybe the United States could offer, is even just this type of infrastructure as models. And all of these things matter because even just in a practical sense, Jeremy Corbyn, as soon as he's elected, there's going to be capital flight. If you want, there's no durable progress in one country without some type of broader achievements across the globe. It's the way it works. They're set up to operate globally. We need to be too, in our own ways, obviously. All right. Well, we got to get to our regular segments, I think. And we will. Matt, are you ready?
Yeah, I can go.
Matt Leck will regulate.
So yeah, I don't have the heart to
That's
keep
fair.
doing that
Knows
every
it
time.
pretty well. You're gonna do it next.
I guess you have to.
Yeah, you do.
It just doesn't feel right. So I want to give props to a filmmaker that I haven't historically been a huge fan of, Oliver Stone, and his The Untold History of the United States. I actually meant to do this for a Friday MR thing, but I think it works better here. The Untold History of the United States is actually a really good documentary, and I have been prejudiced a little bit against Oliver Stone because I thought the JFK movie is too focused on ballistics and Garrison, which are the two parts of JFK that I'm not interested in. But the Untold History, I think it covers it fairly well. I think it's hard to really go into it, but he has a good view of the dark side of it, of American history. But he also has, I think his view of JFK is more nuanced than I think a lot of people on the left have of him. And if you want to look at sort of liberalism versus a deep state that is very military industrial, you look at what JFK was up against. And so I highly recommend that. I know some people appreciated me tweeting out that I enjoyed it because Oliver Stone's one of these guys that people are sort of afraid to say they liked his stuff.
Well, let me second it. I haven't watched all of it, but I watched at least one or two segments of it, and I mean, whatever. It's like anything else. It's like, okay, it's an hour-long documentary, so is it going to cover every nuance of whatever? But that's a great little intro to the history of the United States as an empire.
Oh, yeah.
That's actually super well done, I think.
Yes.
I liked it too, so I will step out on a limb with you. I think Oliver Stone did a good job.
The sort of both in terms of accessibility and what it covers, I think he nailed it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also flipping the kind of narrative that most Americans think of World War II and really understanding that struggle. I think he did very well.
Yeah, it's a good balance in stepping into knowing when to intervene in taking away people's fairy tales, but also not leaving them with nothing, leaving it with just sort of burnt ground,
no, he
ashes,
gives you
right?
even a guy. I mean, unfortunately, and Henry Wallace is a really complicated figure, which we maybe get into some other time. But just even giving you Henry Wallace at his best. You had a vice president for a while under Roosevelt, who was way ahead of the curve, not only in civil rights, but actually really was essentially a prairie socialist. He was to the left of FDR, and he wanted peace, and he wanted a peace dividend to invest in mass social programs. And he himself was like a amateur scientist as well as interested in things like Buddhism and Native American spirituality. And that's a fascinating figure, and a very American one. And Stone gives you a little intro to him.
I was very ignorant of him.
Yeah,
typically, I've heard his name in biographies and stuff, but he's not treated. And to be honest, I don't have a good historical understanding of him. I don't know what is.
Well, what happened basically was I think he went very far, and I would say at the time, very defensively of guys, we could really have a partnership with the Soviets. He was very optimistic. And then I think by the 50s, when reality emerged, he was so burned that he went to the right. Because I think he was actually, in his case, he was actually horrified because I think, he didn't know about the crimes that were being committed.
Right.
Well, he had also already been screwed over at that point by the Democratic Party, who pushed him out of the VP role.
Well, no, and after that is when he moved really to the left. He ran progressive for president, and he moved well to the left. The FDR didn't want to get rid of him, and it was a sign of his declining political capital and health that they pushed Truman in because they already felt like he was way to the left. I think actually particularly on civil rights. Mm-hmm. He was way clearer and no bullshit.
As we know from Kilmeade's Andrew Jackson documentary, Truman was a big fan of Andrew Jackson.
Exactly. So. Exactly. And, Henry Wallace, look, I'm sure that if Henry Wallace took over the presidency from Roosevelt, he would have continued and finished World War II. He would not have committed the crimes of dropping nukes on Japan. Yeah. That's a historical counterfactual you can be pretty confident about. So, yeah, no, I think Oliver Stone does a pretty good job in that. And I think you're right. He's much more nuanced about JFK, and I'm not necessarily a JFK conspiracy person, but I will say this nonsense about Trump being opposed to the deep state versus a president who takes power as a Cold War right-wing Democrat and then basically, as you always say, decides after the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Bay of Pigs, like, you know what, fuck you guys. I'm not going to have a global nuclear war because you have, like, delusions of grandeur and, like, militarism issues. Like, we're not doing that. And at least rhetorically, we will play soon for a cold open. Like, his speech at American University on disarmament, in terms of its eloquence and its vision of disarmament, I don't think that's been matched since.
Yeah. And I always have a problem with how things just get over-personalized to the presidency, right? Like, if you think JFK was bad, like, wait till you get an earful from, like, Curtis LeMay or someone like that. Like,
and wait till you think about the fact that...
the Dulles brothers.
And the Cuban Missile Crisis was literally Bobby and JFK, problematic figures that they were, fighting a military and intelligence apparatus by being cynical, hard-nosed Massachusetts operatives and being like, we're going to create Soviet back channels because these people are fucking nuts. And we're not going to have a nuclear war over a couple of missiles in Cuba. No fucking way. And these people want that. Like, Curtis LeMay wanted that.
They looked at it like this may be our last time to take out Russia.
Yes. It wasn't even like these guys were doing, like, the dumb, like, hey, if you don't, I don't want to do this, but we got to, like, maintain our credibility. They were excited it was happening.
They felt like they were on a clock, and this was an opportunity. And they wanted Russia to just give me a reason, basically.
And Bobby Kennedy Jr. has at least endorsed some writing that I think does point in that direction.
Yes, I would say it points very strongly in that
direction.
Because it's JFK and the Unspeakable. I can't remember who the author is, and I think it's interesting in that genre because it's written by this, like, Catholic theologian guy who talks a lot about, is it Thomas Merton? Merton.
Yep.
But the main thing that he suggests JFK was upsetting people with was his support for African nationalist movements, which is, of course, tied in with all this stuff. But.
Definitely. And that was another thing that I think actually JFK was relatively good about, because while he was very removed, he adopted the right positions, but he didn't have, like, he wasn't as strong and clear on civil rights as he should have or could have been. He supported it, but it wasn't elemental to him. I think his experience in World War II and his actual, like, global travels and respect for people like Nehru actually he was, to the extent a U.S. president can be, and it also made strategic sense at that time in terms of countering the Soviet Union. He was an anti-colonialist, and he did support Africa unshackling itself from European colonial powers.
This is one of the more famous photos of him learning about the killing of Patrice Lumumba.
Yep. And again, people are going to say the CIA was involved with that, and there's no contradiction here.
Absolutely not.
The CIA ran its own foreign policy.
Like, the CIA helped him become president by doing this missile gap thing, and then also, I think, in my opinion, might have helped the people who killed him.
And I think that's very possible. And if you read about the Dulles brothers, two of the most horrifying figures in U.S. history.
They were assassinating other world leaders.
Absolutely. Why would you stop there? Do we have music ready for, or unless David, do you want to jump in on any of this before we get to your? Oh, fuck what happened to JFK? It's fucking capitalism, man.
He's from Texas. We can't trust what he says about this.
Yeah, exactly. Got the fucking commie LBJ over here. Yeah.
How did he get into the police department, Griscom? How did
that happen?
Jack Ruby.
How did that happen, Griscom?
Can you just walk into police departments in Texas?
Oh, definitely.
Excuse me, sir. How are you?
What, you need a gun or something?
Yeah, loan it out for a couple hours.
You want a Glock? That's all we got left in stock, I'm sorry to say.
All the shotguns are being used to police pool parties.
Yeah, right. Yeah, we had a 13-year-old black girl at pool party, so you can imagine all the heavy artillery was brought out to that location. Got a couple of handguns if you'd like.
God, you sound like a king of the hill.
Isn't that what Texas sounds like? You used to sound like that before we trained you for the show.
You know, I actually did have to do speech classes in high school.
When David first came in, David was just like,
accent.
I think Chairman Mao is sort of seriously not, I'm not justifying his crimes, but at the same time, if we don't read Mao,
I want to be I want to be the Willie Nelson of Maoism, sir.
That's what we should. Sir, if you give me the opportunity, I'll see this as part of my journey to being the Zhou Enlai of bluegrass music. The Ho Chi Minh of honky tonk.
I actually really like that.
The Ho Chi Minh of honky tonk.
Actually, all right, I finally found that. If someone like DJ Danerkey, who's already given us, I'm just putting this out there. I think the 1980s or 70s PBS theme is funny, but I'm actually seeing like we just need like a banjo song for
definitely.
Griscom.
Well, what's like characteristically Texan?
Oh, what's music?
Yeah.
Good steel guitar.
Okay.
All right, yeah, something like that.
Yeah,
we need some
definitely.
good country, down-home country music. So I was a bit of a Johnny Cash flavor. And I think, and also something, and we need something for Matt. And I either am wanting something that actually I would say approximates something from Warren G in the G-Funk era, or something like the intro music to Revolutions by Mike Duncan. Some incredibly pretentious classical music. I haven't made my mind up
It's
on
just
that.
like the sound drops from Dan Carlin's Hardcore History.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So.
Boom.
All right, David, without further ado, what's going on with the economy?
Yeah, so I have some interesting news. Some new data just came out from the EPI. So basically, big surprise, the rich are doing pretty well. New wage increases from 2017 just came out. The wages for the top 1% of earners grew 3.7%, while wages for the bottom 90% grew only 1%. Now think about how significant that is when you're thinking about 90% of the economy. I mean, people who are in the 90th percentile, like those people make significant incomes, and even they are seeing a significant stagnation in wages. Just to give you a little context, the highest 1% of earners make around an average of $719,000 a year, while the top 0.1% wages average around $2.757 million. Meanwhile, the average wage for the bottom 90% of workers is only $36,182. So when we're talking about wage stratification in this country, it's massive. And, we've talked a lot about how wages have stagnated for most workers over the past 40 years, but just to put it into context, the bottom 90% earned 69.8% of all earnings in 1979. But in 2017, they earned 60.9% in 2017. So that's a significant drop-off. And I just wanted to talk about this a little bit because we're seeing this huge, disparity in wage growth despite the so-called, recovery. I wanted to make the point that since 1973 to 2017, productivity has increased 77% among non-supervisory workers. So that means people who are in production. That means like real workers, not your boss, right? While hourly pay has only increased around 12.4%. So if you think about that, increases in productivity should mean higher profits, which should also mean wage growth. But we're not seeing that at all. And I just wanted to talk about a concept that might explain why there's this big mystery in rises in productivity while there's still significant stagnation in wage growth. And the main point is this. Is workers produce their own value during the working day. So when you go into work for somebody else, you create value. During that working day, you create the amount of value that actually goes into your compensation. The extra, the surplus value, that's what capitalists take, right? That's how they make their money. So if you're there and you need to create the value of, let's say, I don't know, $60 and you get paid $15 an hour. Let's make it even. And you work an 8-hour day, right? It's $120 in value. Excuse me, sorry.
Are we having a math problem
Yeah,
here?
I shouldn't be doing math live. So let's not do math live.
You even wrote some of the notes, some of the math in the notes for a little. You're having a math problem.
No,
today,
don't worry
brother.
about it. So the
You're
point
right?
is that like you cover the amount of money that you're getting paid. So that if you're getting paid a wage, you make that money in value during the day, and the extra money is what the capitalists are taking.
That's what they call profit.
That's exactly, and that's what they call profit. So this surplus value, that's the materialization of unpaid labor. So if we're seeing higher rates of productivity across the board, we're seeing more and more unpaid labor that's being extracted from the capitalist class. So if we're seeing higher levels of productivity while wages remain stagnant, that means that people at the top are making even more money from the labor that you're creating, which explains the massive difference in wage increases for those at the top 1% versus those in the bottom 90%, the actual workers. And, it's really important to remember this, that capital is the command of unpaid labor. And there's a lot of unpaid labor going on. And this is the rate of exploitation is increasing. And there's a lot of reasons that can happen. That's weaker labor power. That's the degradation of unions. There's also like social conditions, too, that affect how people are paid across the board. And it's also the fear that most workers have of losing their jobs in this current climate. That pushes wages down. That pushes what people will accept to work for down. And we're seeing it more and more in the U.S. economy, especially as we've moved more and more of our economic activity towards the inflation of financialization and towards the inflation of asset values over the increases in actual benefits for working Americans. And it's something that we really need to take seriously, that we've seen a huge drop-off in the relationship between productivity increases for workers and wage increases for workers. And that's a big part of the reason why we haven't seen any wage increases despite all these arguments that the economy is doing well. The economy is doing well for a very, very small subset of the population, and they're really reaping in the benefits of it.
Indeed.
So what you're saying is we need to grow out of it.
I mean, isn't that the problem? Is like you can't.
So we need a lot more people with a lot more good ideas.
We're going to need to grow a lot more.
We're going to have to grow a lot more businesses and just investing and taking that risk, and then they hire people.
Sounds like people aren't taking enough risk.
You can't grow yourself. Like you can't grow yourself out of a situation of disproportionate power. That's the fundamental reality.
Ding, 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 ding.
Not with that attitude.
Yeah, right.
Maybe you don't like capitalism.
Yeah. Maybe if you weren't so negative. Yeah. That actually basically is the answer. Maybe if you weren't so negative.
My negativity is dragging down the entire U.S. economy.
I don't know. I actually misread this half a study on serotonin and fucking geese formation. So hierarchies are natural, and we're gonna pretty much have to not change anything. So fucking A. Or in line with that, fucking A. The reason you said all of that was because of jealousy, and I could prove that because of one of this panels I went to, or one of the talks that I didn't lecture. Excuse me, one of the talks that I attended at this Jordan Peterson forum at Boise State University was a guy who did just a sort of science rundown of things like the lobster and so just even the idea of drawing how serotonin works in our brains versus how serotonin works in a lobster's nervous system. It was pretty funny.
That'll keep the testosterone flowing.
Actually, literally no part of that will keep the testosterone flowing. Neither Jordan Peterson will not, and dealing with all of his pseudoscience will not. I mean, what's amazing is because I had to read a little bit of Maps of Meaning, which is his, that's the real book. And there's two things I'll share. One's funny, but I'll start with a sort of he uses terms or ideas from Tibetan Buddhism to try to this chaos and order is a natural. So he uses words that basically roughly translate to wisdom and compassion. That's the sort of those teachings. There's that interplay, and it's I don't speak Tibetan or Sanskrit, and I am somewhat well read on Buddhism and have done a lot of Western style meditation. So it's I know something about it in a very mediated way, and I know that his translation of those terms are wrong, and therefore the application of it is totally fucked. And I know that as a non-specialist
I'm defenseless against that kind of female insanity.
Exactly. And then the other thing that's funny, and I just need to share this again, is in the beginning of his book, he's talking about how he's having these nightmares about nuclear war and Armageddon, and he's freaked, and he needs help. So he turns to Freud, and Freud is, for everything's about sex. So that I wasn't dreaming about sex.
That'll keep the testosterone flowing.
I wasn't dreaming about my.
I was just dreaming about big missiles.
You're getting onto it. So I wasn't dreaming about sex. I was dreaming about nukes. You pervert.
It produced an overwhelming sense of impending doom,
and it induced an overwhelming exactly. So then he goes, and then I read Jung, and Jung's ideas were more appropriate to what I was dealing with. And then he describes what one of his dream or like he describes the dream, and it's that he's sitting on a couch with his cousin, who he describes as like the most beautiful. And now, to be clear, litigious Jordan Peterson, this is satire and I'm joking. These are not verbatim quotes. And to all of his idiot fans, I'm not taking him out of context because I'm making up quotes to make fun of him. So now let me proceed. So I'm sitting next to my cousin, who's the finest piece of ass on the planet. And she really is incredibly hot. And, the injunction against having sex with your cousin, that's a hard one. Let me think about that. Because on one hand, it regulates social order. But then on the other hand, from a Nietzschean perspective, you should be able to project your will into your cousin. But this is serious. So the dream is he's sitting next to his cousin, and she's the most beautiful girl in the world. And then an atom bomb goes off. There's a huge explosion. So obviously the conclusion is there's that dream that definitely had nothing to do with sex.
I mean, if we wanted to help him sublimate this into something more productive, like, yeah, Jordan, look into the politics of our nuclear arms.
That's the
industry.
other thing. It's like, right? Why does it
have to mean something about your cousin?
Why don't you become we are so overwhelmed by all of this shit that Donald Trump threatening to pull out of a major arms treaty, we didn't even top line it the other day.
Yeah, and I hate that shit.
And I hate that shit too. And this fucking idiot, you know what? He could be running around the country saying, straighten up your back, clean your room. Should really, don't fuck your cousin. And you should really write a letter to your congressperson about the SALT treaty, because the literal existential viability of planet Earth hangs in the balance.
Yeah.
That might be a little bit more useful than bitching about college kids and demonizing transgender people.
Yeah, you want to blow some political capital. Don't hem and haw over Kavanaugh. Get something done about arms deal.
Yeah, I agree with you. We should have existential dread about nukes. How about we work on disarmament and maintaining our, the infrastructure of the 80s and that allowed us to, and earlier, that allowed us, at least us, to not blow ourselves up. Just a thought.
Wow. That's kind of, I don't know, that's amazing.
It's my new favorite.
Well, that segment definitely made me a lot more pissed at Jimmy Dorgan. I never read the comments. Go to you in a second. I just want to say I don't read the comments on Majority Report videos, whatever. But I will, and I shouldn't be telling people this, I will read comments now on Michael Brooks Show videos because we're building it out and ginning it up. And the comments on the Jimmy Dore video, most of them are positive. But we did a segment that I guess we laughed a little bit, but I don't know, grow the fuck up. It was not particularly polemical. It didn't even deal with your favorite hobby horses about the Democratic Party.
It had to do with his favorite hobby horses, which is U.S. Imperial Psyops.
Literally. And the responses were you guys are so mean and arrogant. And it's I'm sorry. You know what? I actually have a lot more respect for Jimmy Dore than apparently some of these fans do, because I actually don't run around Jimmy Dore has a major fucking YouTube platform with serious influence, and that segment might have discouraged a lot of people from looking up Lula, from looking up the nature of fascism as enabled and supported by the United States and Brazil. because of that stupid video, which they uncritically reported. And then the other thing was amazing, which is that this was in 2017. Nobody knew. That's a year after Dilma Rousseff was removed from office. Maybe what you should just say is, please don't make fun of my internet dad, and I didn't know because I'm a fucking moron and I don't want to learn, because the fate of Brazil and America's and the world's most important political prisoner is secondary to my YouTube video watching habits and how I feel about myself.
And I will just also say it fits right into what we've been saying about apoliticized corruption. And I'll just play this full clip here.
Wow. That's kind of I don't know, that's amazing.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. I want to get a Lava Jato t-shirt.
You should get a Lava Jato t-shirt.
You should wear it on the show.
You should wear it on the show, because actually there is a role that type of politics is playing in Lava Jato like things in Brazil and everywhere else in the world.
Let's just launch a lava asado.
Yeah. You're just like, maybe, you know what? Just put Sergio Moro into Google and then maybe read, I don't know, half of the Lula da Silva Wikipedia page and then do the report. And yes, I know Glenn Greenwald was at the same conference, but Glenn Greenwald had already been writing critically about Lava Jato. Jesus fucking Christ. Okay. Support global humane socialism and actual anti-fascist politics by becoming a patron of the Michael Brooks Show today. So proud of what we do and so appreciative of all of you. Patreon.com/TMBS. Subscribe on iTunes, subscribe on our YouTube page, and share those videos so we can keep growing our audience, and not just for ourselves, but this whole world of people that we have around us.
We need to take down things like, look at the way NBC, all the regular ones, are covering, say, the caravan versus not doing a single report on healthcare this entire year.
Exactly. We will talk about some of the caravan stuff, some of the post game. Of course, the Republicans are returning to their core brand proposition of racism, fear, and white identity politics right for the midterms, which is also why there is no time for purity politics. You can't reduce everything at all to electoralism, and you need to get out there and vote for Democrats across the board. No delusions, no fantasy. This weekend, illicit history on indigenous people's rights and sovereignty. We have a really good guest for that. Next week, Harvey K. coming back in studio. Excited to have a professor on his return. Thank you, Brian Mier. Everybody read Brazil Wire. Thank you, super producer Matt Leck, chief economist David Griscom, super producer David Slavic, each and every one of you. See you patrons in the postgame.